I used to think the phrase water rights sounded abstract, like something buried in dusty ledgers and county vaults, not something that could upend daily life. But the week I inherited legal rights tied to a 2,100-acre lake, I learned how fast paperwork turns into leverage. The first question that crossed my mind wasn't about boats or docks. It was whether anyone could really tell me what to do with something I legally inherited. That question would soon be tested by the one group that believes rules apply only in one direction. The lake itself was calm that morning, sunlight rippling across the surface like broken glass, wind barely moving the reeds along the shoreline. I stood there with a folder tucked under my arm, thinking about my relative who'd owned those rights for decades without issue. No drama, no letters taped to doors, no fines. Just ownership, quietly respected. I expected a few months of administrative cleanup, maybe a form or two, and then life would move on. Instead, within days, I was staring at a warning email from the Homeowners Association, written in that stiff, performative tone that pretends to be neutral while flexing authority. They weren't congratulating me. They weren't asking questions. They were asserting control. That was my first hint that this wouldn't be a simple inheritance story. It was shaping up to be an HOA nightmare, the kind people swap online like cautionary tales. Only this one involved water, power, and a board president who believed the lake existed because she said so. I didn't respond right away. I read the message twice, then a third time, listening to the faint buzz of insects in the afternoon heat outside my window. The implication was clear even without explicit threats. The association considered the shoreline and access points community-controlled. According to them, any use of the lake needed approval. The idea that inherited water rights might override their rules didn't even make the list of possibilities. What they didn't know was that I wasn't planning to argue. I was planning to document. If you think an HOA can't push deadlines on property it doesn't own, wait until you see what happens when they put it in writing. To understand why the board felt so confident, you have to understand the neighborhood. It's a planned community wrapped around the lake, with manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and a thick binder of covenants, conditions, and restrictions that everyone pretends to read. The lake has always been the centerpiece, marketed as a shared amenity even though legally, that was never entirely true. My relative had acquired the water rights long before the association existed. Back then, the land was divided differently, and the lake was treated as a resource, not a branding tool. Over time, the association grew used to acting like the lake was theirs. They scheduled events, posted signs, and enforced quiet hours near the water. Nobody challenged it because nobody needed to. Until me. The board president, who I'll call Ms. K, had a reputation long before my name ever hit their records. She was known for walking the neighborhood with a clipboard at dusk, noting violations with the dedication of a hall monitor. Grass half an inch too tall. Trash bins visible after sunset. Holiday lights up one day too long. Petty, consistent, relentless. Karen neighbor drama, packaged as governance. When my inheritance became official, the association sent out a generic notice reminding residents about lake usage policies. It was timed too perfectly to be a coincidence. The paper smelled faintly of toner, still warm when I pulled it from my mailbox. It outlined access hours, prohibited activities, and fines for non-compliance. The implication was that these rules applied to everyone, including me. I flipped through my own folder instead. Inside were certified copies of deeds, a chain of title summary, and a letter from the county water district acknowledging the transfer of rights. Dates, signatures, seals. Not opinions. Facts. I decided then that this would be a documentation fight, not a shouting match. Every letter they sent would be logged. Every notice would be photographed. Every claim would be matched against recorded law. The board thrived on emotional reactions. I was going to starve them of that. A week later, another message arrived, this one labeled as a courtesy reminder. The tone had sharpened. They referenced a supposed rule that no individual owner could restrict community access to shared amenities. They asked for confirmation that I would comply. The late afternoon sun slanted across my desk as I read it, highlighting the absurdity of the assumption baked into their request. I didn't reply. I added it to the timeline. The first escalation came disguised as friendliness. A board agenda excerpt was posted online, listing an upcoming discussion about lake access compliance. My name wasn't mentioned, but the implication was obvious. The association was laying the groundwork to define the issue publicly before I ever spoke. That night, rain tapped lightly against the windows as I pulled up county maps on my laptop. Parcel boundaries, water rights overlays, historical surveys. The lake wasn't a mystery. It had been studied, mapped, and regulated long before the association wrote its first rule. The more I looked, the clearer it became that the board's authority stopped at the water's edge. I requested certified survey maps the next morning. I also pulled a copy of the association's bylaws, highlighting every section that referenced amenities. There was plenty of language about maintenance and scheduling. There was nothing granting ownership of water rights they didn't possess. That absence mattered. When the board meeting rolled around, I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Instead, I watched the minutes get posted 2 days later. The lake access discussion had resulted in a vague resolution to ensure compliance with community standards. No vote. No enforcement plan. Just enough wording to justify future action. 3 days after that, I received my first formal notice. A final notice dated May 12th, printed on heavy paper, warning of potential fines for non-compliance with lake policies. The phrasing was careful, but the threat was real. Fines escalate. Liens follow. That's how these things usually go. I took a photo of the notice next to the certified mail receipt, timestamped it, and filed it under escalation. The sound of a lawn mower droned in the distance as I worked, the normalcy of the neighborhood contrasting sharply with the pressure building behind the scenes. They thought a deadline would scare me into compliance, but deadlines cut both ways when evidence is on your side. I drafted a single response, calm and factual, referencing recorded documents without argument. I didn't accuse them of overreach. I didn't threaten. I simply stated that the water rights were inherited, recorded, and confirmed by the county water district. I attached copies. I asked them to update their records accordingly. Then I waited. The silence lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th, another notice arrived, this time citing a different rule section, CCR Section 4.3, which dealt with mailbox communications and compliance timelines. They were shifting tactics, hoping volume would substitute for authority. That was when I realized this wasn't just about control. It was about saving face. The board couldn't admit they were wrong without undermining years of assumed power. And Ms. K, especially, wasn't known for backing down quietly. I updated the timeline, added the new citation, and prepared for the next move. The lake outside remained unchanged, reflecting the pale sky without concern for politics or paperwork. The association, on the other hand, was just getting started. By the time the second notice hit my mailbox, the weather had turned heavy and humid, the air pressing down like it knew something was coming. I could feel the association's strategy shifting from suggestion to pressure. They weren't asking anymore. They were setting a clock. The new notice didn't mention fines outright. Instead, it warned of corrective action if compliance wasn't confirmed within 10 days. That phrasing was intentional. It left room for imagination to do the work. I added the document to my growing file, noting the date, the rule cited, and the fact that it contradicted the previous notice's language. Inconsistency is a quiet tell, and boards hate when you notice it. I made another call to the county water district that afternoon. Not to argue, not to complain, just to confirm. The clerk pulled up the record and verified, again, that the water rights transfer was complete and uncontested. I asked for that confirmation in writing. She emailed it within the hour. Another brick in the wall. When the association finally responded to my earlier message, it was brief and dismissive. They acknowledged receipt of my documents but stated that community standards still applied. No citations. No explanation. Just assertion. The ceiling fan hummed overhead as I read it, the sound steady, almost calming, in contrast to the irritation creeping up my spine. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about who blinked first. The next move came sideways. Instead of contacting me directly, The board sent a neighborhood-wide bulletin reminding residents that unauthorized control of amenities would not be tolerated. My name still wasn't there, but people aren't stupid. Within a day, I noticed the looks. Curious glances during morning walks. Conversations that stopped when I approached. Social pressure is cheaper than legal action, and the association knew it. I documented that too. Screenshots of the bulletin. Dates. Distribution method. The sun was bright that morning, reflecting off parked cars, making the whole street feel exposed. It didn't bother me. I'd expected this phase. Public framing always comes before enforcement. I reviewed the bylaws again that night, this time focusing on enforcement procedures. There was, buried in the fine print, any fine over a certain amount required a hearing, with notice, evidence, and an opportunity to respond. They couldn't just decide and bill me. They needed process. And process leaves fingerprints. 2 days later, the hearing notice arrived. Scheduled for the following week. Alleged violation, restriction of community access to lake amenities. Potential fine listed. The amount wasn't devastating, but it was symbolic. Accepting it would mean accepting their premise. I didn't plan to attend alone. When money enters the picture, even small amounts, power struggles stop being theoretical. I prepared the way I always do, with paper and patience. I assembled a binder with tabs, chain of title records, survey maps, water district confirmations, copies of every notice they'd sent, and a timeline summarizing their shifting claims. I added a section highlighting contradictions between their bylaws and their actions. No commentary, just alignment. The hearing room was a converted clubhouse space, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead, folding chairs lined up in rows. I arrived early, placed my binder on the table, and waited. Board members filtered in, avoiding eye contact. Ms. K sat at the center, posture rigid, papers stacked neatly in front of her. The hearing itself followed a predictable script. Allegations were summarized. Rules were referenced vaguely. When it was my turn, I didn't argue intent or fairness. I referenced documents. I pointed out dates. I asked where, specifically, the association derived authority over inherited water rights recorded before the community existed. Silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable. They tabled the decision. That was the first crack. Tabling didn't mean surrender. It meant regrouping. Within days, I received another letter, this one reframed as a request for clarification. They wanted additional time to review my documents. They wanted cooperation. The shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. I agreed in writing and set conditions. All future communication would be written. All claims would reference specific bylaw sections or recorded law. Vague assertions would be ignored. I sent it certified. While they reviewed, I expanded my documentation. I requested historical board minutes referencing the lake. I pulled archived newsletters where the association referred to the lake as an amenity without mentioning ownership. Each reference strengthened the pattern. They had always assumed control without proving it. The pressure campaign didn't stop, though. A new sign appeared near one access point, listing community rules. I photographed it, noting placement and wording. Unauthorized signage was, ironically, its own violation under their bylaws. I added it to the file. They were about to learn that social shame cuts both ways when receipts exist. The next board meeting was different. The agenda listed a legal review of lake governance. No mention of enforcement. No mention of fines. I attended this one, sitting quietly in the back, listening to the rain drum softly against the roof as members debated without naming me. The uncertainty was palpable. Authority thrives on confidence, and theirs was slipping. After the meeting, a revised notice hit my inbox. The association acknowledged that water rights ownership was complex and stated they were suspending enforcement pending further review. No apology. No admission. Just a pause. That pause was enough. I forwarded the entire record to the county oversight office that handles association compliance, framing it as a request for guidance. I included the timeline, the notices, the signage, and the hearing transcript summary. I didn't accuse. I asked whether the association's actions aligned with their governing authority. The The response came a week later. Formal, measured, and devastating. The Oversight Office confirmed that associations cannot regulate or restrict rights they do not own or control under recorded law. They advised the board to cease enforcement and update community materials to avoid misrepresentation. They copied the association on the response. That email was the turning point. I printed it, added it to the binder, and waited. The board's reply arrived 2 days later. They announced a policy update clarifying that the lake's water rights were privately held and that community use was subject to permission. The language was dry, bureaucratic, and final. Ms. K's name was nowhere on it. Up to this point, the association tried deadlines, fines, and social pressure to assert control over inherited water rights. By documenting every move and involving oversight, I forced a pause that exposed their lack of authority. The retreat wasn't public enough for them, no. I knew there would be one last attempt to save face. It came in the form of a proposal. They suggested a voluntary agreement outlining shared use guidelines, framed as a goodwill gesture. No enforcement. No penalties. Just cooperation. I didn't reject it outright. I reviewed it, marked suggested changes, and removed any language implying ownership or control. I returned it with a note stating that any agreement would be optional and revocable. The lake was glassy that evening, reflecting a pale sunset, the quiet almost surreal after weeks of tension. The association was running out of moves. They weren't done yet, but their next step would decide whether this ended quietly or publicly. The final escalation attempt came as a rumor. I heard through a neighbor that the board was considering a special assessment tied to lake maintenance. It wasn't official. It wasn't written. It was a test balloon. I documented the report anyway, noting the source and date, and prepared my response. If they tried to fund control through fees, the Oversight Office would hear about it immediately. The rumor died within days. No assessment appeared. No announcement followed. The association had reached the edge of its authority and stopped. I closed the binder, finally, knowing the next phase wouldn't be about defense. It would be about ensuring this never happened again. With the board's last rumor collapsing under its own weight, I shifted from defense to cleanup. Retaliation doesn't have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes it's about tightening every bolt so the machine can't lurch again. I drafted a formal request that the association permanently amend its governing materials to reflect the Oversight Office's guidance. Not a suggestion. A clarification request backed by documentation. The morning I sent it, the lake was shrouded in low fog, sound dampened, like the world itself was holding its breath. My letter wasn't emotional. It referenced dates, cited the oversight email, and included copies of misleading materials they'd circulated in the past. I asked for confirmation, in writing, once updates were complete. They couldn't ignore it without reopening the entire issue. A week passed. Then two. During that time, I noticed small but telling changes. The old signs near the shoreline disappeared. The online handbook quietly updated its language. Where it once said community lake, it now said lake access subject to private rights. No announcement. No explanation. Just edits in the dark. I logged every change. When authority backs down quietly, it's usually because the legal consequences are finally louder than pride. The board's formal response arrived at the end of the second week. They confirmed the updates and stated that no further enforcement actions related to the lake would occur. They framed it as a routine clarification, not a correction. That distinction mattered to them. It didn't matter to me. I forwarded their confirmation to the Oversight Office with a short note thanking them for earlier guidance. That closed the loop. From that point forward, any reversal would trigger scrutiny far beyond the neighborhood. The social atmosphere shifted almost overnight. The sideways glances stopped. Neighbors returned to polite nods and weather talk. A few even asked, cautiously, what had happened. I didn't vent. I didn't brag. I said there was a misunderstanding that got cleared up. The truth, simplified. Ms. K became noticeably absent after that. She still lived there, but her presence on community channels faded. No more nightly patrols. No more bulletin emails signed with excessive authority. Power doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it just shrinks. The climax didn't come with applause or confrontation. It came with a letter posted to the association's website, summarizing recent policy updates. Buried in the middle was a single sentence acknowledging that certain amenities were subject to pre-existing private rights and outside the board's regulatory scope. That sentence was everything. I printed it, added it to the binder, and then set the binder aside. The saga was over. The lake, unchanged and indifferent, reflected a bright afternoon sky as if nothing had ever happened. The wind carried the faint sound of water against the shore, steady and unconcerned. This wasn't a shouting victory. It was a paperwork victory. The most satisfying kind in homeowners association drama, because it leaves no room for revisionist stories later. Aftermath always reveals the cost. The board never apologized, and I never expected them to. Trust, once strained, doesn't snap back cleanly. But the threat was gone. No more notices. No more fines. No more implied control over something they never owned. I kept the documentation. Not out of spite, but out of habit. Boundaries are easiest to respect when they're clearly marked. The association learned that lesson the hard way. And I learned that calm persistence outlasts bluster every time. This wasn't just an HOA revenge story. It was a reminder that inherited rights don't become optional just because someone writes a rulebook later. It was a satisfying revenge story without yelling, without drama, just evidence and patience. If you enjoyed watching an HOA overreach collapse under its own paperwork, please like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment with your own HOA experience. Thanks for watching and supporting this channel. Next time, I'll tell you about the association that tried to fine me for something I didn't even own, and how their own records ended up proving my case before I ever said a war.